immédiatement. Et depuis, pour renforcer notre résilience, il faut d'abord saluer quand même ce geste, parce qu'il faut être aussi reconnaissant de bonnes choses qui sont faites. Il est clair que ça a été un acte fort de la part des partenaires, de la part du Fonds monétaire, et évidemment, c'était un signal positif, mais pas suffisant par rapport à l'ampleur du choc que la Covid a laissé sur nos économies. En même temps, l'impact de cette crise qui s'est maintenant aggravée avec la guerre en Ukraine montre clairement que nos besoins de financement vont bien au-delà de ce quota africain. Le Fonds monétaire international lui-même estime qu'il faut un financement additionnel de 252 milliards de dollars d'ici 2024. D'ici 2025, plus précisément. 252 milliards de francs pour l'Afrique seulement. Alors même que nous n'étions pas encore au début de la guerre en Ukraine. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous avions plaidé et nous continuons à plaider pour obtenir une réallocation d'une partie des droits des pays riches qui ont d'autres mécanismes et qui ont mis en œuvre ces mécanismes pour faire face à la pandémie, que ce soit les États-Unis, l'Union européenne, tous les autres grands pays, la Chine, ils ont mis en place des mécanismes qui ont permis à leur pays non seulement d'être résilients, mais de financer la relance économique. Donc nous plaidions pour avoir 100 milliards de dollars. Jusqu'à présent, ceci est devenu quasiment un mur infranchissable. En réalité, il n'y a pas de réallocation. C'est la vérité. Et on parle maintenant d'une nouvelle émission de DTS. Voilà le problème de l'Afrique. Et quand on parle de nos problèmes, certes, il y a des oreilles attentives, mais dans la plupart des cas, les gens, ils ne sont pas attentifs. Parfois, ils sont polis, ils nous écoutent, mais après, bon, ils passent à autre chose. On passe à l'Ukraine, on passe à d'autres sujets. L'Ukraine qui est un sujet sérieux, un sujet grave, très grave pour l'humanité. Et nous devons tout faire pour arrêter cette guerre. Tout faire pour l'arrêter. Et ses conséquences sont mondiales. Donc, voilà ce que nous, Africains, nous constatons dans ce contexte difficile, mais heureusement, il y a quand même parmi les partenaires, parmi les Européens, les Américains, parmi les pays développés, des gens qui sont engagés pour plus d'équité, plus de justice économique à travers le monde. Alors, je n'oublie pas l'enjeu de la transition énergétique, une des thématiques de vos travaux. Elle est essentielle pour nous, cette transition énergétique. Parce que là aussi, on a voulu nous condamner à renoncer aux énergies fossiles, à renoncer aux énergies qui ont fait le développement de toutes les parties du monde qui se sont développées, de l'Amérique, de l'Europe, de l'Asie. Alors, on nous dit, bon, il y a le réchauffement, donc il faut bannir les ressources fossiles. Ceux qui le disent, c'est eux, justement, qui consomment encore beaucoup de ressources fossiles polluantes, comme le charbon, comme le pétrole, et un peu moins le gaz. Je crois que ce débat, il est d'ailleurs clos, puisque dès lors que maintenant tout le monde cherche du gaz à travers le monde, donc il n'y a plus de débat sur Glasgow. Alors, l'Afrique est partie prenante de l'accord de Paris sur le climat et nous sommes pour la préservation du climat, nous sommes contre le réchauffement du climat et c'est pourquoi nous avons demandé le financement de l'adaptation pour que nous n'empruntions pas les mêmes chemins que les pays industrialisés. Là aussi, depuis la conférence de Paris, on attend les engagements sur les 100 milliards de dollars par an pour financer ces projets d'adaptation pour l'Afrique. Et nous continuons de travailler à la mise en œuvre de l'accord de Paris à travers des stratégies de mix énergétique. Aujourd'hui, au Sénégal, je suis fier de pouvoir dire que le Sénégal est à 31% d'énergie propre, renouvelable. Renouvelable. 31%. Entre le solaire, l'éolienne, l'hydroélectricité, nous sommes à 31% de notre total productible. Et notre ambition, c'est de basculer tout le reste, c'est-à-dire les 111% qui restent, de les basculer au gaz, to power, donc complètement pour abandonner et le pétrole et le très peu de charbon, puisqu'il n'y a que des privés d'ailleurs qui font du charbon ici, pour moins de 50 mégawatts. Donc c'est quasiment insignifiant. Donc grâce à nos efforts de mix énergétique, un pays comme le nôtre, qui a...
We have the sun 365 days. And here we say rainy season or dry season. We don't have the 4 seasons. And by the time we're talking about Africa with its 600 inhabitants still living without power and well, Africa. Here I know that those are the expertise. I commend that because these experts, they claim of the development paradigm. So we are not in war against development. We want to develop partnership. So I am keen on making your without the basic perspective for emergence. We all saw the difference between developed countries and developing countries. The main difference has to do with infrastructure. When you are in developed countries, you see the highways, the bypasses, the trains, and in developing countries, you have bumpy roads. You have to address all these issues. This is what we need to address in Africa. Infrastructure development, and you have to do it without any complexities. We see that we are able to make bypasses, highways, we have trains. We can have what is being done at the global level in terms of infrastructure. We need to have partners so we can invest in harbors, in electricity lines, in huge major hotels, in digital infrastructure. We have to digitize our economies, just to name those examples. And Africa, which is being developed, is also the Africa that feeds itself and contributes to feeding the world with its land resources and hydro resources also, by modernizing and promoting its agricultural sectors and also the husbandry. But unfortunately, Africa with colonization was constrained. I don't know. We discarded our natural way of feeding, because when you look at the cereals and when you look at the world, you have predominances per continent. Europe is the continent of corn, and Africa is the continent of millet. And we discarded millet and we import rice from Asia. And now we're just eating rice all the time, and we do not produce a lot of rice, and we do not produce corn. And that's right. This is a huge issue. And then we say that we are going to increase that, because we do not control neither the production, the logistic chains, and we are just the victim of the conjuncture, and we lost our feeding habits. And our people have been eating rice. You cannot wake up one fine morning and say, well, you are no longer eating rice. This is a food for thought. We have to think deeply about that. Our friends are very fertile in their imagination. Our friends from Cote d'Ivoire, they eat acheke, they eat smoked fish, and we have our friends from Burkina also. They have the aloko, and they have the local banana. And so the food is there.
Senegal is bread, butter, bread, chocolate. This is not produced here, and then so you have the rice. That's not possible. So we see that there are difficulties, challenges we will have to fix. Of course, that will take time. I mean, we intended to start bread with wheat, associated wheat or maize, millet or never die, whatever. I mean, that has created. We have to be less dependent. Otherwise, we will always face all the shocks with difficulty. We need to learn to consume what we are producing and to produce what we are consuming. In a nutshell, we have to invest in real economy that will make us free and be able to have to face our the needs, the vital needs. That is the basis of the Senegal Imaging Plan, like the new town that you've seen in the new city that you've seen in Diamniadio. Some years ago, 7 years ago, this used to be a no man's land with some farms. We will continue our policy of social and territorial equity, but this is a consequence of an imbalance, and this has been inherited from the colonialism, because most of the African countries are in the coast, and when you see in a satellite map in Africa, everyone is dark except only the capitals. So we have to curve the trends. We have to go in the the interior of our countries. We have to develop the internal parts of the country. That's what we are doing through some programs, namely PUDC, to bring electricity, water, but also to build the roads and productions roads to link production zones to the markets. I would like also to mention that we have one of the biggest projects of in private investment, which is the port of the future, the port of Dayan. We have launched in January the works in partnership with Dubai Port. I would like even to mention that several countries like Senegal are in the same vein of having a positive transformation. If ever we merge all these efforts continental-wide, we have an economic power that is coming out, and we'll have to see how we can harness the global economy. I mean, it means that despite all our difficulties, we have to count on ourselves, and we have to work very hard, diligently, and by really listing our needs, priorities, and choices. That will give sense to an Africa partner leader. I declare over the works of the conference, and I wish full success to our check changes, and I thank you. It is always useful and encouraging for someone really for someone who is aware of the conference, because our governors, our leaders, they know really the topic, whether it is in all senses, and what is coming back always is about partnership. Now we are done with the aid, and we thank you, Mr. President, for that. So this, now I will leave the floor to Shahanchad, the OECD Ministry Council. There will be an invitation. Micro. Please tell him he should speak into the mic, please. English speakers, please just mention him that he is speaking. He should speak into the mic so as for us to be able to translate. Thank you. Please tell him to use the mic for us to be able to translate. Thank you.
Solennellement cette lettre d'invitation. D'invité d'honneur de l'OCDE.
Moi, j'aimerais une discussion avant de partir. On peut continuer.
C'est formidable. What is remarkable is that the program has moved because the president will be staying with us. We'll start with the panel one, Mr. Lorenzi. We will give the floor to Dr. Shakante, who will actually presenting the opening of the proceedings. it is always difficult So the topic, critical topic for today, Mr. President of this conference, is the Africa partner. Partner who is based on your priorities, your orientations that you gave us. Africa, the Africa we want. I mean, a prosperous Africa from an inclusive growth and sustainable growth. United Africa, a integrated Africa, which is focused on the values of Pan-Africanism, Africa, where peace and security lies, Africa, where democracy, human rights, the governance are present, and Africa, where the growth is safely based line
has really contributed the least across all regions to global warming. We actually are, among the most exposed region and highest. Can you? Okay. And in terms of the losses that we face, 3 to 5% of GDP, actually the type of financing that we need to cope with climate change. So that's even before all the series of shocks that we have faced, starting with the pandemic. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, actually the continent faced the worst recession we have seen in half a century, with the GDP contracting by 3.2% in 2020. And then we were on the way to a moderate recovery. However, and we were expected to continue that recovery in the current year. However, we have been faced by a series of challenges in that recovery. First, we had the issue of global rising inflation and actually monetary tightening by major central banks in the US and Europe and elsewhere to cope with that rising global inflation, which means for the continent actually that the cost of borrowing have significantly increased, while the continent is on the pathway to recovery. Then we also, on top of that, face the consequences of the war in Ukraine, which really compounded the situation with major socio-economic implications. So we had, in addition to, of course, all the terrible human losses and devastation, there is massive economic consequences that are faced globally but are particularly hitting the continent. And these are triple shocks. We have a food shock, an energy shock, and a finance shock. Just to put it in context, we have actually the highest level in terms of food prices we've seen in over 3 decades. We have also seen the energy hitting levels that were the highest since 2008 and then moderating a bit. Now they are the worst since we've seen since 2014. So the size of the shock is huge. We've seen that also in terms of the increases in food prices and energy. So if we take into account the fact that in the continent, households tend to spend majority of their expenditure on food, average 42%. This is significantly higher than elsewhere, and in some countries actually it's more than 70%, for example in Angola and South Sudan. So what all this translates into is that this crisis is particularly hitting the most vulnerable, putting them at risk, and actually increasing the risk of hunger and undernourishment, which already was escalated during the pandemic. And at the same time, the continent and policymakers, as His Excellency the President had referred to earlier, don't have the type of space and tools that advanced countries had in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So they really had to struggle with very difficult policy choices in terms of what they need to do to cope with the pandemic. As a result, the fiscal deficits in the continent doubled, and debt levels have been rising fast. And now the situation is even worsened with all what is happening globally and with the consequences of the war in Ukraine, with higher cost of financing and reversal of capital flows to developed countries. So all this in terms of the situation. So what all this is leading us to is that we need to rethink really the existing tools in the global financial architecture. What we had before was a system that is more fit to deal with country-by-country crisis. However, we've been having a tsunami of crises, one after the other, of global nature, and with huge implication for the continent. So some of the things that have been happening and where ECA have been actually advocating the reallocation of SDR. There has been, some countries that pledged, but as the President mentioned, it's not enough. We haven't seen the level of reallocation that is required to help countries in coping with all the series of shocks. But also we need to have these SDRs channeled through regional multilateral development banks, such as the African Development Bank and other regional multilateral development banks, to actually benefit from leverage so that these SDRs create more scale. But also we need to make sure that we enhance liquidity of the financing for countries by creating these secondary markets, deepening secondary markets, so that the cost of financing in the long term can go down. And this can be achieved by facilities like the liquidity and sustainability facility that ECA had suggested. I'll be happy to extend more, but I see that I'm running over my time. Thank you.
Just depending, il faut demander à l'orateur de parler dans le micro, s'il vous plaît. Pouvez-vous demander à l'orateur de parler dans le micro? Pouvez-vous demander à l'orateur de parler dans le micro, s'il vous plaît? There was some slight timing issue. Christian, you have 8 minutes. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for hosting us here. And I'd like to get back to some issues you raised, Mr. the President, and to come up with a precision and recommendations if you enable. So, good afternoon all. So, what strikes me in these proceedings is the team that we have and all the proposals like those of OECD. They seek to intend the accessible fundings and to regulate the average cost of debt for African countries. So those are at once quantitative objects and qualitative objectives in terms of risk premium and risk given to African countries. It is in this regard that I'd like to get back to each of the 4 items you propose in terms of funding. The African mechanism for stability for financial funding is not neutral. We talk about the monetary stability and we're talking about financial stability because Africa is a continent with several currencies, so you cannot promote the overnight African monetary integration, and we have to attract more capitals regarding the financial stability and to stabilize the systemic crisis, bank crisis, financial systemic crisis, and the main object that is likely to contribute to the African debt for member countries. So during our proceedings as a financial committee, we had about 200 billion euros, which is about $200 billion. And the amount likely to help this mechanism to scale up from well, let me get back to an issue you raised, Mr. the President, and everybody talked about it. Well, when I say me, it's us. I do not accept the idea that we have to put an end to the allocation of SDRs to Africa. So I think that as we as decision makers, economists, we have to keep fighting, and you recognize by yourself that the president, the French president, is making efforts in that respect. It's also some European countries that are more reluctant to do that. So I link this issue to the issue of mechanism, because the mechanism should partly help fund this. So this is what I have to say regarding the SDRs. So another issue, I think that Jean-Claude Trichet talked about it. This has to be seen not as a disruption of credit, but the open war to rating agencies such as Moody's or Fitch. There are some 4 rating agencies in Africa, existing rating agencies, and we have to commend that the idea is to have a major rating agency which is private, but which will be upscaled with the initiative of places, the banks, the development banks, of course ADB and other regional development banks, sub-regional development bank, that will help set up this rating agency. And we have to work on criteria that are less against African countries. When I say less unfavorable, I mean we have to set up extra financial criteria. Today we have issues such as climate change, and this should be the leitmotif of this Pan-African rating agency, which should contribute to reduce the risk cost. The third aspect is more technical, but it is also a political one. It has to do with the setting up of guarantee measures to reduce the debt cost. I'd like to have one word on the financial networks. Madame Lagarde, that you mentioned earlier, was right when she said that Africa can achieve what we cannot do in Europe, like corporation schemes, to an exception. With an exception, I did not say the model, but an example, and I do not make the confusion between example and model, like Redex. And I think that against a background of 40 years we're trying to talk about the African emergence, we have to go beyond competition. I work with on how we can work together in financial places, and deliberately I told to my to audience that not too much, it doesn't take too much in financial places. We have to work together and to scale up cooperation, including with regulators. So by way of conclusion, Jean-Claude Trichet said it a lot of times, all this should be done on the basis, on a volunteer base. You cannot impose from the top schemes African countries that will be in the African mechanism or financial mechanism, and that will be stakeholders in the Pan-African rating agency, and that are in the network of financial places in West Africa. That has to be done on a volunteer basis, and I think that a lot of African member countries will be in those mechanisms voluntarily without any constraint, from a simple analysis of the advantages on the differences that you mentioned. And through thanks to Dr. Sheikh Kante, I'd like to ask all countries to consider the advantage of the involvement, the participation, and that will bring very quickly, without waiting for the long-term successful outcome. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Christian, for the density of what just said. This is just awesome. I think that this is really perfect, because you talked about the financial places. If you can go overseas, and have a quota with Tijan Cham. He is there, but we have some technical glitches. Good morning, can you hear me? Yes, we can, but we don't see you. Yeah, here we go. The most important thing is for you to hear me. So I'd like to commend the President Macky Sall for the action he is doing at the helm of Senegal and the African Union. And for me, I'd like to thank him for his presentation, and he covered almost the key issues. So I'm just here to make some observations as the core panelist. Mr. the President, one thing I'd like to highlight is that African growth and is really good this year. So you were talking about the powerful economies of G7 countries, and which is really new, and I commend that. So we have to have a GDP, higher GDP for Africa, and I really commend your optimism. And a lot of Africans are just supporting you, and I'd like also, would like to thank the Circle of Economists, also OECD for organizing this event, and people other than me have highlighted the adverse effects of the pandemic and how it affected all the African economies which were fighting against COVID. And I'd like also to commend African countries and the proceedings of the Minister Kante, and I think that the financial sector, we tend to underestimate it. So just like Jean-Claude Trichet, I appreciate what is being done here, and we have to increase the resilience due to the Ukraine war, and we have to commend the Circle of Economists. And this is really something that is unavoidable. We have to think about the crisis in Europe, and we have to see ways and means to absorb those shocks. So me as a banker, as a banker, we always wish the meter to work and to be alive, and we seek to have favorable conditions so the borrower can borrow money in the easiest way. So we have to strengthen the resilience of the economies, and increasingly we have to speak out loud, which is good. And there's no favorable wind for someone who doesn't know where they're going. So we have to lean on our partners so we can direct our energy in the right path, the right direction. Just a few words. We all talked about it. I think that it is really important that, well, this is just an additional contribution, and I think that the existing institutions have to be very, very extremely reliable, and we need to have a finer understanding of African realities, and investors will gratefully acknowledge that. Some institutions are doing a very important job because they are close to the ground, on the ground, and they know the challenges facing our countries, whether it is Mali, Senegal, or Cote d'Ivoire, so they can make more enlightened investment and a more solid investment. So the investor will tend to demonize the investor, but this is really important to keep loyalty with them by taking into account to risk the liquidity, because we need cash so they can send bonds as a default risk, And I think that we have to make sure that the investor is rational, is objective, and we need to, if there is a communication issue, we need to have some explanation so the investor can be quiet in his mind and believe that he will be reimbursed. So I'm not going to get back to what was said, but we have to build trust with those who are who are likely to bring in some flow of investment. We have to do things properly. We have to use our know-how and make clear explanations so the investors can be more predictable. The investors do not like bad surprises. All this has to be done in a very clear way. And you'll see gradually that interest rates will be good ultimately. If you take a bank chief who has its property rights and who respects the appointment and who keeps telling you that I'm able to pay, or I'm going to pay late, then you have more interest rate. The borrower has to look into the behavior, and I think that this is important. I was just saying that because when you do the rating, we have to do the rating, the sovereign rating, and I was in Indonesia, and Indonesia was handicapped in its rating. So a good role the state can do is to improve the rating because it has a cost for the companies that are in the country. So I don't know, I do not have enough time. Let me talk about the financial places. It is really important to do a networking of the financial places, but we cannot develop them if we do not have a local model that works properly. We cannot base our development on borrowings according considerations that are totally independent from us. Well, you heard Mr. Jean-Claude Trichet. In Africa, we've been handicapped by that. We have technical issues here. Sorry. When I was at the head of Prudential was the first French owner in the United Kingdom. We have technical glitches here. The sound is not coming properly. We have many problems technique. Then we have the collection of the money spread and the mobilization in terms of local resources that are invested in local companies. This is key. So this has been well illustrated, the privatization of companies. We have the sovereign and the infrastructure projects are ideal when you have good insurance companies developing also a retirement system to mobilize the spared money. That may be small, modest, but at the level of the continent, that will be an important amount, and that will help fund the local companies when there are local currencies. So I'm going to stop here, and just by way of conclusion, I commend this initiative because what comes most in the global economy has to do with intellectual leadership. We are facing challenges we have the quality of our ideas, but I'm sure we can come up with good answers to our challenges. So thank you again, Mr. the President. I renew my congratulations to you, because it's just like this that we can have the progress that we need, and we can move forward by getting the G7 involved, and we just do not have to stop. And I think that I have a lot of friends here in this room, and a lot of friends I love. We are all behind you for a better and prosperous Africa. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Tijan, for this reflection and for linking it up to the conclusions of Christian. So here in this room we have Morocco with Mr. Benjeloun, who is the boss of the MCO, who is going to share with us these items, and all the group of the scientific committee and the work that has been well spelled out by Christian. So Lionel, don't go away. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I'd like to commend the leadership and the partnership of the President of the African Union and Senegal, and I thank you as conveners and for inviting us as representatives from Morocco to invite us. So you asked Jean-Hervé, you asked me to speak about the African mechanism for financial stability, and as a representative of a private bank, I think that, well, I'd like to commend this reflection to develop a stable economic growth, and also that we think about some proposals that have been made about this mechanism and the guarantee mechanism for the African economies and in some financial places, because the African mechanism exists everywhere in the world. I think that Mr. Trichet said it, the fact that I think that what speaks to me was the pragmatic aspect of this mechanism, which explains what is being done with estimated costs, which is about $2,400 billion, which is about $300 billion. And also, my understanding is that just 1/4 of the African funding will be in the process, and this requires the willpower, and we have to make sure that the SDRs are going back to African countries. We have 80% from the African Development Bank. I think that this pragmatic approach of the regional approach with ECOWAS and SADC, I think that we all need to set this up. If you want, I'm really delighted of this initiative from the African agency, and this is linked to the second item of my intervention. We need to have quantitative and qualitative criteria, also financial criteria, and we have the Moody's agency and as part of the company social responsibility for emerging countries, we have about 4,900 companies rated by Moody's, and Christian said it is crucial to have the sustainability dimension. These company social responsibility and others have mentioned, and the President's presentation spoke to me, and he just lectured us on the need for African development, not only Africa but also Senegal. But if you allow me, the issues in terms of investment, we have to make sure we convince Africa, the private sector, promote PPP and promote the perception of Africa. But from a financial standpoint, as a banker, we have to come up with global solutions, and we have to enhance the financial system. And this is not just a brainwashing, and Africa has to be considered and be funded with the funding that makes sense. And we have to convince the international community to set up some timeline, and the development objectives should be showed for and understood for funding through the banks. We make our annual reports according to international standards. Well, this makes sense. This gives sense to not only to the bank institution, but that will enable us to make sure that across the globe, not only in Africa, we speak the same language. You may find some investors who may not have considered Africa before, but because Africa has a solid financial institution that respect all the criteria, so they will have another look at Africa in terms of investment. And of course there is private integrity, and of course the idea that the loan is key should be taken into account. This is the message I'd like to convey. And
if I got the President's message, it isn't just to impose Africa based energy transition when the countries are greatly noticed that this African region are the most exposed. And I truly took note of some figures. 250 billion US dollar. I mean, the mitigation costs are about more than 700 billion US dollars. How can we reach? How can we get there? I mean, what we're trying to do about energy efficiency, the future of finance should be finance through the product should have a component with technical assistance. It's not only about money. We would have a given ecosystem that would enable the transformation, and English people would talk about raise awareness so as to be able to measure the impact. I mean, the future of Africa and the future of banks in Africa, they'll be enough to invest in Africa. We are in the northern part of Africa, and we continue to invest in Africa. So I didn't want to go beyond the 8 minutes, but we have to take into account the finance that will impact the debt and equity, and we should be able to have the money to promote it and to attract all the international investors. I thank you. Thank you, Ibrahim. I would suggest that for 8 minutes, Lionel Zanzi, if you could share your reflections in 8 minutes. Thank you, Mr. President. I am very honored to take the floor. The Senior Minister, thank you for provoking that meeting. Madam from OCD, thank you. I used to be a student, your student, before being your assistant. This was 45 years ago, 40 years ago. This was just 10 years ago. Really, I am promoted. Mr. President, I would like just to change a bit the tone by taking into account when you said all the positive things that you underlined of the situation of double crisis Africa is faced with and the situation of the world. We have already, and this is Afro-optimism, we have already really started building on what you're asking us. It is important to have further information on the African economy, but there are very important progresses. For instance, the African Union has now a voice. There are special envoys, namely Tijan, on topics. African Union is able to negotiate collectively. This is the huge progress. Alongside with President Ramaphosa, when you came up with the idea of reallocation of FDR, you were in a management to 50 countries were talking together. I would just add for Tijan that 2,600 billion of GDP. When we talk about the buying power, what you can buy in terms of goods and services, this is multiplied by 2.5. So, we can say that now we represent something of, but also we should be able to explain it collectively. Now, thanks to you, we have a voice, and when we say the partnership should be inclusive and not exclusive. So you express what 1.5 billion, I think, at COP28, there was a group of the African countries deciding about the fate of the Treaty of Paris. Mr. President, this is the image of progress and governance. We have more companies, and Mr. Benjamin is an installation that are cross-cutting, Pan-African, and we have qualitative progression of our governance. Yes, we have, there are new voices. Yes, we need project in rating, and several countries are faced with a rating issue. For instance, my country, Benin, in the past, it was difficult to convince public decision makers to find a rating and go to the market. I don't know if I had any influence on talent, but Benin has a rating, and for 5 years. We have the process, the mechanism. At a more modest level, the scoring of companies. Today, we can provide credit to our countries in microfinance because we are starting to see the scoring of countries, of companies. We know ourselves, and we have voices like your voice to break ignorance. I do always talk to investors, and they say that the African risk has increased. This is what has happened to Eritrea, Mali, and Guinea-Bissau. Yes, but 5 countries that contribute to less than 5% of the GDP of the country, they should be perceived as a barometer of the 49 other countries that are in very different situations. So we have to admit that we have to get to have the right information. Mr. President, what the leaders should say is you. There is a debut of rating agencies. WARA, for instance, is a Senegalese rating agency in partnership with the first African rating agency. There is quality agency in Nigeria. We are at the beginning of a consolidation, and the idea of the Professor Boissio is really actually in progress. I even don't know if I should say that, but there is a dynamic, Mr. President, to decrease the risk premium, which is should not be the case. We have to develop insurance mechanisms. There are insurance mechanisms that have to scale up, for instance, West Africa Guarantee, or SFAGAS, or FSA. We have the profession of insurance. That will enable to decrease the rates, and we will have the insurance instrument which is subscribed by our countries on the political risk. We realize that we never use the Liga. The advantages of using not going through a professional mechanism which is public or private, and that gives guarantees within our countries to increase the credit of our SMEs, and that could be done even if we are the informal companies. That we have to scale this up. It's not a kind of a vain hope, and we just have to dynamize it, and this is existing. That is the reason why, Mr. President, in the tragedy of COVID tragedy, we realized that the massive finance, the microfinance, is a way to meet our populations and to provide them with buying power and cash. And we admitted within the realm at the central bank window, we can refund those microfinance institutions. We can preserve what was an emergency measure to the cost significantly of the true access to credit of our small and medium-sized companies and our households. There are measures that are undertaken. They have to be I think that a stop, I believe that we all have to stop. Do not upload. Mr. President, in terms of infrastructure with media, you show that there are no fundings for new services in our country. We see that in climate finance, you succeeded. You shown that we can change the energy mix. So we have new instruments, and the question is that we should take example of Senegal. Let us take into account your leadership. But the first steps are there. Thank you. So I would suggest while concluding, I would suggest that we say the Gambling investment and he is very skilled.
Merci infiniment.
Thank you, Excellency. Mr. President, I am very honored to be invited by you and to take the floor in front of you. I would like to thank Dr. Kante and his team for having interesting organized this program. In the quality of rating agencies, we follow up these new dynamics in terms of leadership that you install in Africa. I would like also, and I think we have been talked about the agency. So we've been existing for more than 15 years. We are based in Côte d'Ivoire. So we are a Pan-African. We are even more than Pan-African. We are international because we intervene in France and England. But also to follow the steps of Tijan. Our agencies have been created. Green was created to address some challenges. We are rating in local currency, and it's important to understand the difference between the rating in local versus external currency. When you look at the rates that are if you look at the rates that are the one from the international agencies, they assess the capacities of the country to engage in external currencies. It means that systematically the African countries are in a weak situation, and that is the reason why we're talking about a sovereign cap, which is happening in external currencies. That should be based on the level of currency reserves and the policy of currency. I mean, you can be a very performing country, and you can have a bad rating because you are in a military zone where the reserves are not sufficient. Concretely, we are rating 10 countries, namely Senegal, which is rated by Senegal Impulse. It is B+ in external reserves, which is very high. Senegal is rated as A-, which the low risk. So this is the credit quality of Senegal. It's important to understand that all the African countries should be rated in their own currency to establish the real credit. And for fundraising, we have to take into account this criticality. This will enable the investors to have a better visibility on the quality of the borrowers. For instance, if this is a foreign investor who is not aware of the existing of the local currency, I can have a better idea of the borrower, which is not always the case. I mean, it's important. And this is a major difference that we're doing, and that is important. All you're talking about a Pan-African rating agency, that's a good idea. But there are rating agencies, African ratings that we have to consolidate. I think we have to create a mechanism revolving around those agencies so that at some point they should be able to face to the external situation, because we know the environment, the methods are different, but the approaches are different, and the approaches will make that we have this differentiation in terms of rating. And when we have an equivalence, the rates that we have in local currency, by taking into account the fact that we can have a certain gap and we don't have a problematic of currency transfers, we will come back to the same rating system. This is what we propose, established with the Fitch agency, which is rating the safer region. We are in the good logics, and I wanted to mention that because I think it's important.
Regarding the four agencies existing in Africa, the important thing is to remind that two of them have been bought once again by Moody's, and two that are purely African, Bloomfield and Oversight Nigeria. So to me it is really important to note that, and I think that we wish them to remain African. I think that this is clear, and I think that this is really important, and we have to highlight that. And the logic to borrow more in local currency, as Tijan Cham just said, for me it is really important for African countries to borrow in local currency to avoid exposing oneself to foreign currency. In terms of credit, the most important thing is not the debt stock, because we see oftentimes people are talking about African countries that are already indebted. Well, as long as you can reimburse your debt, that's not a big deal. You see, Japan has borrowed about 66% of their GDP, but Japan has local currency, and it is really important that African countries start to be indebted in their own currencies, and for that we have to open the capital markets in Africa. The capital markets are really locked in Africa. In Senegal, for instance, you cannot borrow in South Africa or in Nigeria. That is a huge challenge. We have to open up the capital market that will help us have a better Pan-African market, and to have a Pan-African market we have to start by thinking to convert our currencies between themselves. We can start from one country to do some trading between one country to another. If you want to purchase something in Ghana, you have to pay in dollars. That is a big issue. And in West Africa or in Central Africa, if you have to take the euro, this is a big problem. So this right move to come up with African issue solutions, we have internal solutions, and we have to set them up to open up our capital markets. We have to borrow in local currencies, and we need to have stronger African agencies that will help us re-establish our credit lines and to help set up this very good direction. Good move. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I think that this session is meeting its requirement at a personal level. I'm really happy, and what Tijan said is right. So we have to work on the capacities, to strengthen our capacities, because in this type of situation, Christian and all of them said that, and we command Mr. Sheikh Kante, and I'm really proud to take part to this. The second observation is that the 6 speakers, I think that 5 of them, they command Christian's position, and so the SDRs can be validated, and that stability mechanism can be set up. The third observation comes from what Leonard said, and I think that this is really important. You know, Mr. President, we have the instruments, we have the tools, and there were some bottlenecks, and we have the 2 rating agencies that were sold, and some people will just tend to perpetuate the African risk perception, and I think that the goal, the objective is to consolidate the mechanisms and to build on the existing situation, so we can have the instruments that be up to par, and we lot of things to say, and from what Tijan said, that African GDP deserved to, well, with that GDP, Africa could be at the G20, and we have to work on the existing instruments. We have to consolidate them, and that will enable us to change Africa's face in front of the world. Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Hervé. I'd like Mr. the President, you have observed that all the speakers, they're in line with your strong ideas. They gave you the truth. They said that you are truthful, and the Senegalese people just gave you the truth through your social contract and your vision. You have your ambition, you have your dream, you have the reality also, which were born from a highly reliable economic model. Because Mr. the President, my professor, Christian Bossier, was used to tell me that we have to question the history so we can have landmarks. In Africa, we used to have 4-year planning systems from 1961 to 1989, and starting from 1989 we have 5-year plans, and we have the poverty reduction papers and the accelerated growth. The issue is that the growth from these models will not help us absorb the shocks that we were facing, and the models, they just kept us being more poor. And with the Senegal Emergent Plan, in a short while we have the growth 6%, for instance, by combining the qualitative and the quantitative system, which is really rare because in the classical systems we have growth rates that are borderline, and now here you are doing really well. Mr. the President, you were right when you anticipated, because Africa is going through issues that Europe and America faced centuries ago. Mr. President, the first financial mechanism, a profitable instrument to address the debt issue, was created in 1694 by King Fahd, and to create the definitive conditions, because in 1916 the debt from England in its GDP was 53%. In 1966 it was 300%, but with this mechanism they were able to not only reimburse their debt but also to have an inclusive growth. France in 1776 set up the same thing under the same condition. In 1790 Alexander Hamilton created the conditions to reimburse the debt of the 13 colonies. And in 1913 was born the reserve, the American reserve, which is leading us. This model is linked, it got to Europe in 1971 with the Pierre Wagner report. That which is valid for Europeans and Americans should be valid for Africans. We need to have a strong mechanism, and that mechanism we have to set it up as quick as possible, and that rating agency we have to set it up as soon as possible. We need to federate the board of directors and associate other rating agencies and even the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and OECD, etc., by taking into account the financial criteria. I will not get back to the monetary guarantee system, not will I the networking of financial places, but we have to take action. the time is for action. Time is to action, Mr. President. And as usual, we have to use a fast-track system and do it as soon as possible. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Sheikh Kante, Mr. Senior Ministers. Thank you to all of our panelists. I'd like Mr. Jean Hervé. I'd like to thank you for facilitating this meeting, and I know that Mr. Foka will conclude. Well, we do not stop when the President is done speaking. So, since you take the floor, then let's just go to the end of it. We're done now. So, we had a highly instructive afternoon that was very, very rich, because the ideas that were conveyed by these prominent experts, and most of them are part of the scientific expert committee. So I'd like our economic speech to be based on the very relevant analysis they've made. So I'd like to commend Dr. Sheikh Kante, who is economist Jean Hervé, Professor Jean Hervé, Professor Christian, but also commend Mrs. Anna Morsi, who brought a highly important touch on the need for funding for Africa, globally speaking, but also from a sectoral basis. Just to say that we have huge needs, just right following the two shocks, and we have Mr. Brian Benjamin also of the BNCO, who made a huge reaction on the African mechanisms for financial stability. And here also, I think that with the central banks, with the banks, the African companies, well, I think that we can have 200 billion, and with the states, I'm not sure this is a big deal, and we have to get the private sector involved as well as the public sector. So we also commend the extremely brilliant performance by Lionel Zinsou, who is always very, very educated, especially the decrease of the capital cost, and we have to scale it up, to scale up those tools, and especially tap into what you're doing. Thank you. Again, where we have enough tools at the level of the continent, and of course, Tidjane Thiam, where he made a presentation on the proposals on the financial markets, and we thank you for his availability. Mr. Zeze, so I send him my greetings. So as regards the reaction to the tools, everything that was said regarding the rating agencies, but also an evaluation of our local currencies, I think that this is really important. And also opening up the capital markets in Africa, because if we can build parities with our currencies, then we'll make huge steps forward. For instance, in the CFA area, we have the CFA and the Naira. We can have a stable parity. The prominent representatives of the central bank, it will be good that they listen to this discussion. There's West African Central Bank, we have the Vice Governor who is here, and I think that he's the one acting right now, and we have the National Governor of BCAO for Senegal. I think that these are really important instruments, and our central banks may enlighten us and also be at the disposal of the states to reinforce this mechanism for financial stability and participate to the rating, the positive rating of our states. And what Stanislas just said really strikes me. We have to have our African rating agencies. We have some agencies here, but even if they are not sold yet, but people will, they have the tricks, the shenanigans to bypass that. And so if we do not have any more rating agencies, that will be really challenging for us. This is really important that we support them and we keep them. And we have also to work on a complementarity basis. We do not have to gloss over what is already existing. We have to take into account what Pan-African agencies, skilled African agencies can do, and we have to encourage them to work on the basis of transparency. I also thank the representative of OECD, the ambassador also, the president also of the Development Center, Mario, who is in our committee of experts, and all those, and also the time manager who did a very stringent job. And by way of conclusion, I'd like to leave the floor to the ambassador who made it before concluding. Okay, he is from the Observatory of OECD. Before that, even when you leave, Mr. President, there are 3 other panels, because when you leave, we have the feeling that we have a lot of work and a lot of things to learn. Well, I'd like to make it clear, because when you leave, Excellence. Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. President. I have to speak in English.
Well, this has been a very, very interesting meeting for us too. We are, the OECD, I have to say, how to put this? Dear President, we are aware that the OECD has some problems of reputation in Africa. And I'm telling you that we are willing to overcome those problems. Not only me, not only the Development Center, it's the Council of Ambassadors of the OECD that is aware of that problem. I think that what we have done in the OECD, and that's something that I would like to humbly present to you and to the rest of the audience today, is to align the whole OECD behind the Development Center to work with you, to work with Africa on equal footing as partners. That general approach of what we are doing, Raga knows very well as director. At this moment we are designing a new strategy. The OECD, we are not so much concerned about what has to be done, but we are concerned, Mr. President, about how we can do that, about how. And the how means, in our opinion, how to mobilize investment for productive transformation and for quality jobs in Africa. And I think that modestly we have 2 proposals for you. One is already in operation, which is to select the priorities for productive transformation by creating a platform for investment and productive transformation in Africa. That is already done. That is already underway. And that means that we are creating a mechanism to establish with you and being led by you the priorities of investment in Africa, productive investment in Africa for the future. be in terms of connectivity, be in terms of quality infrastructure, be in terms of regional integration, be in terms of integration in the global value chains. And on top of that, as you know, because we have been presenting that to you today, with the African Commission too, we are ready to set up, under your leadership, an observatory for investment. We believe that in microeconomic terms, investment is going to mobilize more in Africa if, first, the priorities are clear, and B, if the analysis and the information for the markets is there. And that, Mr. President, is missing at this moment. So this is our program, this is our humble task, but just by concluding, we have, I think, the OECD ready to help Senegal, to help Africa on equal footing as partners led by Africa itself. Thank you.
So we'll be back right after in 15 minutes we'll be back. Merci.
Le triomphe d'une vision.
est-ce qu'on peut se retrouver maintenant pour se rasseoir pour commencer à travailler?
Could you please get back to your seat so we can start working?
temps, tu dis? Oui.
Absolutely, ok. Parlez dans le micro, s'il vous plaît. Parlez dans le micro. Vous pouvez lui demander de parler dans le micro. Ok. Which means that the others won't get understood. Given that, I'd like to thank OECD, especially the Development Center, on behalf of the President of the Republic. Could you please ask him to speak in the mic? Pouvez-vous demander de parler dans le micro? Please ask him to speak in the mic. Please ask him to speak in the mic. Thank you. Yes, translation is going on. Translation is going on. Translation is going on. Translation is here. Translation is going on, so yes. Are you good? Yes, we're good. Yeah. We are good. I don't know what's wrong with the headset. So ask him to speak in the mic, please. Please ask him to speak in the mic. Ask him to speak in the mic. Please ask him to speak in the mic. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, translation. You have to turn off all the mics that are there. You have to turn off the mics. Please turn off the mic. Il faut éteindre les micros. Merci. If you do not speak, please turn off your mic. Turn it off. Turn it off. Thank you. Thank you. Please, in the mic, ask him to speak in the mic. We cannot hear him if he does not speak in the mic. The speaker has to speak in the mic. Please. Mrs. Raga for the involvement in the reflection around the development process of African countries. That's why, Mr. President, Manuel Spudero, dear friend, the President asked me to let you know that without any reservation, they accept your idea for an observatory for the investment in African countries. He also asked me to work alongside you for its immediate achievement. He also asked me to have an official mail prepared with all the TORs. So thank you so much, Manuel, for your commitment and yes, vis-à-vis the President and vis-à-vis Africa. Having said that, Alain, without further ado, I'm giving you the floor. Thank you. Well, you already have the floor. The floor was yours, so you can present the second panel and remind that all the panels will be together and you have to ensure the task assigned to you, which is to facilitate. So the fundraising for the transformation, the qualitative transformation, I'm not going to get back on the major concept. So third panel, we have the energy transition. Without further ado, I'm suggesting that we give the floor to the panelists. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Je ne sais pas ce que je dois faire, c'est pas clair dans ma tête. est-ce que je dois poser des questions aux panélistes? Ça, c'est un honneur, c'est un privilège. Comme je l'ai dit, dans cette seconde partie, nous allons parler non seulement des besoins d'investissement en Afrique, mais sur la façon de mobiliser des investissements pour l'Afrique. Et pour ce faire, nous avons M. Jamel qui est là-bas. C'est le docteur du développement économique et de l'intégration de la Commission de l'Union africaine. C'est très important de l'avoir parmi nous. Ensuite, nous avons Madame Raga. Elle a été déjà présentée comme la directrice du centre de développement de l'OCDE. Ensuite, nous avons M. Ahmed, Madame Ahmed, qui est la présidente du Conseil national des employeurs du Sénégal. Merci beaucoup. Votre présence est très importante pour nous. Et ensuite, nous avons son Excellence M. Hassan Hassiri, qui est l'ambassadeur du Maroc ici au Sénégal. Merci beaucoup d'avoir fait le déplacement. Donc, sans plus tarder, nous allons donner la parole. Mais pour nous, on ne va pas faire 8 minutes, mais 7 minutes, parce qu'on est en retard. Je dois prendre mon vol. Donc, j'aimerais vous remercier. D'abord, je vais donner la parole au monsieur qui est en charge du développement économique et de l'intégration économique à la Commission de l'Union africaine. Ensuite, il est là pour remplacer une autre personnalité qui n'a pas pu faire le développement. Donc, merci M. Jamel. Donc, le programme de l'agenda de l'Union africaine de 2030 inclut comment faire pour développer notre économie. Donc, c'est une initiative heureuse de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Quels sont les types de partenariats que la Commission de l'Union africaine a mis en œuvre pour l'atteinte de cet objectif? Merci beaucoup, vous avez la parole. Donc, je commencerai par remercier Son Excellence M. Macky Sall au nom de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Et pour répondre à vos questions, nous avons eu à bénéficier des conseils de Son Excellence. D'abord, en tant que représentant de la Commission de l'Union africaine, il nous faut souligner que nous avons eu l'assistance du président pour mettre sur pied le partenariat, l'Observatoire africain sur les investissements. Ensuite, nous avons aussi le soutien du centre de développement de l'OCDE. Donc, c'est le premier cas. Donc, pour être beaucoup plus précis, nous sommes avec vous et avec son excellence, surtout ses conseils très avisés. Nous allons réfléchir sur les agences de notation. Les propositions du président sont les bienvenues. Et j'ai eu à travailler sur ce sujet il y a 6 ans pour mettre sur pied un mécanisme de stabilisation. Nous avons eu à présenter les défis que nous rencontrons, surtout les défis pour mettre sur pied les agences de notation africaines. Donc, il nous faut avoir des données et nous allons travailler avec l'OCDE et avec aussi une collaboration étroite des gouvernements. Nous allons travailler au niveau de la Commission de l'Union africaine afin de combiner les expériences. Donc j'ai entendu tous les commentaires et peut-être que je devrais parler des défis et parler aussi de ce qui a été fait pour atteindre cet objectif. J'aimerais aussi revenir sur le commentaire de son Excellence le Président. Il a parlé de garantie et comment faire pour que de fonds de garantie et comment faire en sorte pour que les investissements soient moins risqués. Donc, bien sûr, pour l'emprunteur, il y a toujours des défis, mais nous essaierons d'amener les outils à notre disposition et travailler au niveau, dans ce mécanisme au niveau africain pour mettre sur pied cette plateforme et au niveau financier pour l'assureur et le réassureur pour éviter de réduire les risques et aussi de réduire les coûts d'emprunt. Ensuite, le président a aussi parlé du mécanisme financier africain et de la sûreté financière. Et encore, cette proposition, nous l'accueillons vraiment avec beaucoup de bonheur et nous allons travailler avec beaucoup d'organes. Il y a le président de la commission, ensuite le comité exécutif et ici aussi je vais inviter l'OCDE à travailler avec nous et nous revenir avec des propositions. Et on en a parlé un peu plus tôt, mais nous allons travailler pour voir comment procéder à la mise en œuvre de tout ceci et comment établir, comment nouer des partenariats pour la réalisation de cette initiative. Il y a eu un point sur le mécanisme panafricain. Donc, il y a eu des pays qui ont été réticents pour nous joindre dans ce processus, mais nous essayons de les convaincre de travailler avec nous et de travailler pour le mécanisme de stabilisation. Et nous travaillons étroitement avec les parties prenantes. Et nous allons travailler étroitement aussi avec les ministres pour voir comment procéder à la mise en œuvre. Et ça peut être une partie de l'observatoire, ça peut être inclus dans l'observatoire. Dernier point, j'aimerais revenir sur les institutions financières panafricaines. Et j'ai écouté les autres d'intervenants et je pense que nous pouvons réaliser quelque chose de très très vite. Bien sûr, la Banque panafricaine d'investissement, nous avons des types de banques et nous avons la bourse africaine qui est le réseau de toutes les places financières où on peut regrouper les marchés financiers africains. Nous avons recruté un consultant nous attendons, la ratification a été faite, pour certains il y en a qui traînent des pieds, mais nous avons identifié l'ancien président du Ghana comme un champion. Et mon dernier commentaire, si vous le permettez, l'initiative que je viens de mentionner au début de ma prise de parole, nous allons vraiment faire de Macky Sall, son excellence Macky Sall, un champion. Avec les initiatives qui ont été identifiées par l'OCDE et avec la Commission de l'Union africaine, nous voulons vraiment une adhésion des États membres et ensuite nous voulons vraiment aussi une ratification des instruments légaux et faire de ce projet vraiment un projet phare. Donc merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup.
Because
merci parce qu'il y a vraiment un appui très solide envers cette initiative. Nous ne travaillons pas de façon isolée, nous travaillons parce que vous avez jugé que c'était vraiment pertinent pour l'Afrique. Donc, on a essayé d'aborder un sujet, mais M. Kanté maîtrise très bien ce dossier. Donc, merci d'avoir participé, d'avoir pris part à cette conférence avec nous. Et nous sommes très confiants que ce souhait devienne une réalité. Merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, je vais passer la parole à Raga, qui est la directrice du centre de développement. Je suis son partenaire. C'est la directrice du centre de développement. Donc, elle va nous parler un peu des rouages de l'économie africaine. Donc, pouvez-vous partager avec nous pourquoi l'importance de partenariat pour le développement des économies africaines. Merci. Mon partenaire en crime, Mano, et comme vous décrivez notre relation comme telle, c'est vraiment un plaisir de travailler avec vous depuis l'Espagne et ensemble nous sommes déterminés à faire de ce partenariat au bénéfice au profit des populations africaines. Merci beaucoup, chers collègues, de m'avoir invité ici aujourd'hui et ça a été un grand plaisir pour vous et ça a été très instructif d'écouter les premières présentations. C'est la première fois que je viens ici sur le continent africain en tant que directrice du centre de développement. Je suis persuadé que ça ne sera pas la dernière fois. Donc merci beaucoup et M. Kanté, merci pour votre implication et votre leadership. Et surtout, vous voudriez bien transmettre nos remerciements au président pour nous avoir fait l'honneur d'être ici. Donc les sujets dont on parle ici, comment mobiliser de grands investissements pour l'information des économies africaines, ça c'est essentiel et c'est quelque chose c'est quelque chose et au niveau de l'OCDE, du centre de développement, nous travaillons là-dessus. La pandémie de la COVID-19 a été un réveil et l'industrialisation de l'Afrique est essentielle en raison des chocs externes et des vulnérabilités et il apparaît clairement que la chaîne d'approvisionnement a été perturbée et qu'il y a eu des crises alimentaires.
Was discussed well by
the speaker in the previous panel, Hanan Morsi, we have gotten good at solving different countries' problems, but now the problems all seem to be very global. So we are learning, and I completely second what she said in her intervention. The world has become more complicated. So what is there to do? First of all, regarding the latest crisis, the war in Ukraine, ending the conflict and building a lasting peace, of course, is the priority. It's a priority for the Ukrainians, and it's a priority for all of us. Well, we hope that this will happen soon. There are, of course, urgent measures to be taken. First, in that respect, to reopen the ports in the Black Sea to allow Ukraine to export its agricultural goods. Secondly, by maintaining global markets open, producing countries must not hoard food and fertilizers to the detriment of other countries. And thirdly, scaling up financial resources to provide emergency relief to vulnerable countries and populations. And these emergency measures must go hand in hand with reforms to tackle the vulnerability of African economies, investing in the transformation of African agriculture and industry is the only way to build resilience to future shocks. And dear colleagues, as you know, Africa's transformation is taking place in a fast-changing and increasingly uncertain global environment. And this is something that we have documented over the recent years in the Africa Development Dynamics report that we are very proud of producing every year with the African Union Commission. So I don't know if the representative from the African Union Commission, oh, there you are. Thank you very much for all of your support. And the African continent is also changing fast. Demographic growth with an additional 375 million youth entering the labor market by 2035 is driving a rapid urban transition and increasing the need for quality jobs. This presents unique challenges and opportunities for both policymakers and for the private sector, for the firms, both within Africa as well as outside Africa. Africa needs to achieve high economic growth that translates into more jobs. The continent experienced the second fastest GDP growth rate in the world from 2000 to 2019. However, this growth has not translated into enough jobs. Investment, dear colleagues, can play an essential role in diversifying economies, reducing vulnerability, and in creating more jobs. However, business as usual is not an option. A step change is necessary. Even before the pandemic, financing per capita in Africa decreased, both for domestic revenues and for external financial flows by 18% and 5% respectively from 2010 to 2018. In 2020, because of COVID-19, 38 African economies saw their GDPs decline compared to only 11 during the 2008 global financial crisis. Colleagues, we are gathered here today because we know that the private sector and the development partners can and should play a stronger role in financing Africa's investment needs. Investment in infrastructure and connectivity is a case in point. More than 600 million people on the continent lack access to electricity, which will be discussed here in the next panel. Africa needs between $130 and $107 billion annually to bridge its infrastructure gap. However, on average, the private sector committed to invested only $6.4 billion annually between 2015 and 2018, compared to $33.3 billion in East Asia. Indeed, the private sector and development partners can play a much stronger role in mobilizing financial resources, but also in what we do best at the Development Center, at sharing good practices on how to invest those resources so that they can translate into real development impact. It is with this ambition to achieve real impact that the African Union and the OECD set up last year a dialogue platform to share good policy practices on investment. We now stand ready to bring this work to the next level, and as was discussed here before and mentioned and welcomed by President Macky Sall, as we heard from Sheikh Kante, and also from the African Union Commission, we have been proposing to set up a joint African Union OECD Observatory under the leadership of the African Union Commission. And just to reiterate the value of the observatory, I believe that this observatory can help address some of the bottlenecks to mobilize greater investments for quality jobs and advance the priorities that President Macky Sall is championing as chair of the African Union, at least in 3 ways. Firstly, by improving knowledge about Africa's priorities and needs for productive investment, including on infrastructure. And second, by analyzing the quality and impact of investment flows and partnerships on productive transformation. And third and lastly, by supporting a dialogue among African policymakers and their partners to find ways to fast-track resource mobilization and project implementation. Dear distinguished colleagues and attendees here today, I hope I haven't gone over the time, but just please allow me to conclude by saying that we at the Development Center firmly believe that multilateral cooperation can play an important part in helping Africa mobilize new resources for productive investment. Together, under the leadership of the African Union Commission and with the vision of President Macky Sall portrayed here today, the OECD and the Development Center stands ready to mobilize its broad network of partnerships and expertise to this end, and I hope that the takeaway from this meeting will be that we are all willing to pool our resources and cooperate to make this happen. Thank you.
And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. May. You represent employers, the private sector in this roundtable. Could you please share with us your view on the key actions that African governments and the Senegal presidency of the African Union in particular should prioritize to foster investment and private sector development in Africa? So what should independent and private investors do on their side?
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to say that we listened to with great interest various speakers revolving around the need to highlight and commend the leadership of President Macky Sall with the African Union. We'd like also to thank Professor Dr. Sheikh Kante, and we'd like to say very quickly that indeed regarding the ambitions that have been expressed this afternoon for the socio-economic development in Africa, we could name the need to put in place infrastructure, economic relaunch, and food sovereignty. These have been mentioned. These are critical actions for the African Union, but also within the stability of political environment and social peace, for some coordination of debt management as well as monetary policies we do believe as well that we have to lift the or rather we have to soft the direct mechanism, because for the private sector it's always difficult, and we have also to define as a private sector the means of participation of the African private sector so as to strengthen the economic sovereignty of our continent. We believe that we should, as a private sector, to better organize ourselves to better harness the investment outreaches and public services, PTP. We have to increase our capacities of investment in the social and economic zones. We should also pool our efforts as a private sector to invest in the critical sectors, energy, infrastructure, transport. The President, before concluding his remarks, mentioned three challenges we have to fix to address. I think that by saying what should we do to attract further in private investment, if we listen the intervention by Dr. Champ, I think he responded to that question, and we should not just come back to repeating the same proposals. I think given the funding mechanisms to be set up for the private sector, I think the Prime Minister seems to also respond to that question. I would like maybe just to supplement that you mentioned the FAGAS and this African Solidarity Fund. I think this mechanism should be pooled so as to enable the SMEs to have access to fundings and be able to carry out the intervention. And the very last challenge which was mentioned was how to promote the PPT. I think that we always need the legal framework we need investment to, because the countries have foreign PPP laws, and there is a participation regarding the local content, I mean the African private sector, and all our processes, there should be a concentration so as to have an economic sovereignty and to involve the private sector. Of course, our responsibility is to increase our capacities so as to intervene and I think that on the 23 and 24 there will be a meeting of all issues of the continent, of 29 countries, to say these are our needs, our development project as a private sector. This is one of the most integrated sectors of the continent. Insurance and companies, they will say that we are interested, we want to set up this mechanism to participate to I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting. I think several ideas have been expressed here, and for the most critical element is about now how to implement all that was said. So the implementation is very important, and the prospect and the diagnosis and the needs of what we have to do, this should be done. Thank you.
Have a very pragmatic approach, and therefore what we are trying to do is something that has to be related to many countries, maybe 10 countries, maybe 20 countries. I'm speaking about the observatory, and therefore the participation of the employers in this endeavor is going to be very important. Listen, in Europe, we believe on one thing. We believe in social partnership. We believe that we cannot go anywhere without employers and without the employees. And what we are trying to do here is not something that up in the sky or in the in the top of a pine. We are trying to ground solutions. And in order to ground solutions, we have to do that in every single country. And in order to do that, we need your active, proactive participation. So thank you very much for that predisposition of yours. Thank you. And now I would like to end up this round with Her Excellency Hassan Nasiri, the Ambassador of Morocco in Senegal. Dear Ambassador, Morocco is a dear partner of the Development Center. We have been working so closely for such a number of years with your delegates there. We know of your investment throughout Africa. We know about the need for triangular collaboration. We know about the need for South-South cooperation in investment. So, in that sense, Morocco has been particularly successful in attracting investment, for example, in the automotive sector, and is now a very active investor in the rest of Africa. So can you share with us your views on what we can learn from the Moroccan experience and what, in your view, the Senegalese presidency of the African Union could do to advance more investment, including intra-African investment? Thank you.
First and foremost, please allow me to thank dutifully His Excellency Mr. President Macky Sall for his nice invitation, and to commend and thank my dear friend Sheikh Kante, Professor, who enabled us to come together and discuss about this acute question. I was blessed enough to be the last speaker or close to the end, so I'm going to skip on what was said before. I think that most of our partners, our friends from OECD, of the Club of Economists, they enlightened several aspects of this issue. I would like to thank His Excellency Zensu. I think that we learned a lot from this very rich meeting, and especially I note with satisfaction that our traditional partners from the north through OECD or the Club of Economists, and like our friend from the south of Europe or the north of Europe, reiterated the availability to keep supporting Africa, to keep assisting Africa in its path towards development, especially after all these disasters caused by the geopolitical conflict that we all know, and the pandemic. To answer your question, I'd like to say that regarding Morocco, in Africa, this is its traditional vocation. It is an African country that was first in Africa as the first space, but Morocco has always had relationships of cooperation and partnership, whether it is between Africa and our friends from the north. The Moroccan experience in terms of partnership dates back from the 60s, and globally we were working in the political integration of Africa with all the relationships we had for the creation of the Organization for African Union, its creation, and we tried to promote the African integration, political and economical integration. The 80s in the 80s, well, we had another approach with the partners and the partnership between Morocco and Africa, and I can say that we were at the forefront of this partnership of this generation that started at the end of the 80s, and you know, even in the partnership literature, it only started in the 90s. So Moroccan presence is based on partnership, and we are not in the classical dynamic of trade, but we want to build together co-development and co-emergence. So we have a lot of similarities, or if you will, we have capital we call the factorial endowment, which enables us to work on a daily basis. And we take into account the specificities of these countries with which we share a lot of values, but also we try and be at the level of the expectations. We try to meet the expectations, and in this area there are a lot of specificities that we need to promote. In terms of cooperation, we are in several sectors, starting with the bank, the insurance world, but we are also in other sectors, including in terms of human development, of course, with the number of scholarships that we give every year, but also there are some actions in terms of capacity building that stretch all the year round. The cooperation with Africa, well, we are doing it in terms of solidarity. Each time we are asked for some help by our brothers, we are there. And there is also, I was talking about the partnership and the solidarity aspect, but also the experience sharing. In everything we are doing in Morocco, everything we succeeded, we try to share it with our African brothers. Actually, Africa, as it was said around this table, Africa needs us all. First, Africa needs the Africans and the friends of Africa around the world, and we have interest that Africa be autonomous and that it has not only the living means but also of emergence means, and we are doing our level best to do that, but we have to also trigger the recovery that we have at Africa start again and eradicate all the challenges that we went through recently. And I think that the most important thing is to put the emphasis on the value chain. The continental value chain is really important for us. It is really important at the local level first in each country, and important also at the national level and at the regional level and continental level also, because actually if those value chains are not timely, then there will be bottlenecks in terms of development, and we won't be able to move any further. And we want to be able to set up some industries. But we all know that even if we take all the reports at the global level, including the African Union, the priority is always given to industrialization. We cannot imagine industrial takeoff without setting up a value chain that is appropriate and that will help us uphold our projects and facilitate communication, exchange, sharing. And I would even say that this concept of value chain should be part from now on of our African culture, because sometimes when you go to far-flung areas, the areas that are far from the capital city, you have areas that are really landlocked and that are really sorry areas, and you have to link them up to the public roads and to have them connected to the telecommunication means for an empowerment. So it is not just something the public authorities have to do, but it is a PPP, because our main issue, I'm going to conclude with that, is that today the impact, no matter the policies that we're carrying out, the most important is to put a finger on the impact, and the impact is that thing that happens to all the citizens, especially those that are in the very vulnerable areas. So today I think that regarding all of our policies in Africa, we have to work on that notion of impact. We can work on all the macroeconomic policies, but as long as the impact doesn't reach the citizen, then this is a failure. So the private sector has to work on that, the public sector also, and the PPP should be operational, and our policies have to be more inclusive, and our policies have to be more sustainable also, because we cannot lose sight of the fact that there is an environmental dimension. It is not just because we have other priorities that we have to underestimate the environmental aspect. So we have to include in our policies the environmental aspect, because we are building for the future, for the long term. So it is not a luxury to talk about environmental issues, but it is a way to have long-term construction and to do something that is sustainable. So we talk about the impact, because in the past we used to talk about the impact. The impact is always included in the project studies, but if it's not just the institutional and structural impacts, but the direct impact to the citizens. This is what is lacking to us, because in several countries when you talk about poverty, well, it is done at various degrees. We have average classes in all, middle classes in all African countries, and we have people that do not have anything to envy to the high civil servants, but we have far-flung areas, and we have to work that out. Well, this is a problem of territorial justice. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Merci. Could you please ask him to speak in the mic? Could you please ask him to speak in the mic, please? Donc j'aimerais bien terminer cette table ronde. Donc les investissements sont indispensables, et nous avons vu qu'avec la pandémie c'était très difficile, et je vous demande, nous savons tous que l'Afrique rencontre beaucoup de problèmes, et il faut vraiment essayer d'impulser le développement économique du continent. Et il y a eu vraiment des perturbations au niveau de la chaîne d'approvisionnement dans beaucoup de pays. Donc la crise alimentaire, la crise au niveau des intrants agricoles. Il nous faut vraiment des marchés beaucoup plus intégrés. Et ensuite, il y a beaucoup de ressources. Quel est le problème avec les investissements? Certains investisseurs ne veulent pas prendre de risques parce que les marchés ne fonctionnent pas très bien.
Exactly what is happening. They are not able to.
Donc, il y a des affaires qui connaissent un réel essor dans beaucoup de pays africains. Could you please ask him to speak in the mic? Could you please ask him to speak in the mic? He is a little far from the mic. Est-ce que vous pouvez lui demander, s'il vous plaît? L'Union africaine et l'OCDE ont lancé donc cette plateforme et nous sommes prêts vraiment à mettre sur pied cet observatoire des investissements pour l'Afrique. Donc, l'observatoire nous aidera à augmenter, à développer nos économies et à attirer les investisseurs en Afrique. Donc, rapidement, ramasser donc, j'aimerais conclure en disant que for the future of Africa, for the future of Africa, we need to create opportunities for all and get everybody involved for the development of Africa. We are going to work closely with OECD in partnership then and under your leadership. Et après ces mots, maintenant je rends le micro à Mario pour la dernière session. Le président Escudero doit se rendre à l'aéroport.
Très bien. Bonsoir à tout le monde.
Good afternoon, each and everyone. Given that we're late, I would like to suggest that we have an intense panel, and we call on the participants to the panel to join us. I will tell you who are the participants. We have Abu Rishad, who is the National Agency for Energy. He is a manager. We have Richard Sini, please join us here. He's the head of the IBC. He's based in South Africa. And we will have as well the participation by and lastly, Mrs. Laurence Lalio. Please, if you could join us.
Alors, madame, venez ici, moi je vais me mettre sur le podium. Madame, asseyez-vous là. Moi je vais parler ici. Regardez. Venez. Non. D'accord. Les changements du setting sont rapides et donc on peut passer à notre travail de contenu. Voilà. Alors, vous trouvez maintenant, après cet rapide changement du setting, Mamadou Falkan, qui est ici à ma droite, et donc, personne me l'a dit, hein? Allez. Voilà. Ah, parce que venez. Vous venez sur ma siège. Venez ici. Voilà.
Voilà, on est maintenant bien installé.
We can get started. A debate which, as you know, will be specifically on energy transition. In a nutshell, here we have the Dean of the University, Mr. Ali Miaya. We have also we've been working together in Senegal Emission Plan, Mamadou Falkan, but who has changed now, who is the Permanent Secretary of Third Coast Petrogaz. He is in charge of the energy policy for the Senegal. We have Laurence Padjo, who is a professor of public law at the University of Parlementaire, and we have the minister Sheikh Kanté, who is with us. We have Sini Suita, who is the head of the public policy in Abeisa. But why are they all with us? We would like to discuss energy transition, and because we have to discuss on the paradox between Africa and SCP, and we realize that even if there is a contribution to the greenhouse gas, Africa is still faced significantly to the consequences of global warming. In the same time, we know that Africa has to also has to reach an economic growth. And some resources have been discovered, but not production is yet to start. So if energy resources are there, what should we do? Because there is a need to decrease the carbon, to move to the faster energy transition. And then the question to be debated here is, how should we do it from now on? I don't think that there are standard solutions that could be applied to all continents. Here we want to discuss on the specificities of Africa to build this. The European countries have committed themselves to several aspects, but what we heard today, they are not bound by those commitments. There is a first dimension, which is what should we do to make sure that the commitments will be fulfilled, and that there will be some question on the stability fund, on the risk that was already discussed about the African countries, and all this will be treated by our colleague Sini. But at the same time, we've heard in the last session that there is a transition which is about the industrial African structure and the type of industrial policy which is indispensable. It is a condition for the capacity to move to a transition, an energy transition. And as we've heard in some interventions, there are economic special zones, but also there are specialized zones on SMEs that could be targeted. At the point of energy transition, is that when we have a major company, we can tend to change all the system. But when we have several SMEs, the issue of energy transition is more complicated, and also we're not always equipped. So these are things to be done. The question therefore is, where should we discuss with the Muslim countries, and we'll have also to discuss with the African countries on the appropriate strategies for energy transition. So this is what should be discussed, and my suggestion is that we start the discussion with the only person who is not in the table, but who could define the scenario, the representative of the International Agency of Energy, which is preparing its own report on energy. So I'd like to take you the floor for 8 minutes to Arnaud Rougier, who is in charge of the Africa program at the International Agency for Energy. Arnaud, are you there? Arnaud is there. So we can see you very well, but we cannot hear you. Could you speak aloud, please, Arnaud? For the time being, we cannot hear you. Are you connected to the volume? So we're going to start with Simi, because Arnaud is faced with some difficulty.
Is largely also a program of financial engagement that have not been complied. So what are these gaps, and what could we do in order to comply with these financial needs, please?
Thank you, Maria. Good afternoon. I work for Absa Bank, one of South Africa's largest banks. We have financed 4,000 megawatts of renewable energy in Africa. We further committed to spend about $7.5 billion by 2025 to finance climate-related investments across the continent. We are in 14 countries, and we actual presence, and we cover all 54 African countries. Now, the question of climate change is really a question of finance, is a question of global policy, is also a question of economic growth, as well as energy security. One can call it the holy trilogy of addressing the climate change problem. Because if you don't address climate change, in the long run, we are all in trouble. We know this. But here's where the question is, what do you need to do to mobilize finance? And what do you need to do to get action from African governments and the developed world? Now, Mario, you are correct. We entered Glasgow with a broken promise. The $100 billion was not met, the commitment by developed countries. And I think that has led to a loss of trust for many, many countries, not just in Africa, across the emerging markets. Now, as a private sector, we are forging ahead. I've already said we're putting more than $7 billion of our own money to finance transition in Africa. Other banks across Africa are putting billions more, but this is simply not enough. We've already had the scale of the funding required per annum for climate finance is about $50 billion on average. Now, the African private sector and investors generally today have been criticized for being risk-averse, for not understanding the market. I would argue that the African investors, the banks, the financial market investors, long-term investors like insurance companies and pension funds understand the risks very well. And this is why each and every one of them has said we will put money for climate adaptation, we will put money for obviously renewable energy. However, the policy environment is a big issue. And I think Mario, today we're very encouraged to hear about the work that the OECD is going to do with the AU on the investment observatory. Because even before we had climate change crisis, even before COVID, even before the last crisis, the investment climate in Africa can be improved, must be improved. I can give you 4 areas. 1, taxation. 2, energy policy and long-term certainty of PPAs, the power purchase agreements. They're very important for investors. 3, it is very important that cross-border flows are resolved. The ability for investors to get their money out, including money in local currency. Because it's easy for us to romanticize local currency investment. But if you're an investor who is faced with a local currency risk, when you take money out, you will have to consider that. So it's simplistic to say let's develop capital markets locally and hope for the best. Investors still have to factor in currency risks. The third issue now is the original sin, which is macroeconomic stability. These are all problems. You cannot have real investment, long-term investment, if you don't have macroeconomic stability. And I think the President and other speakers earlier on spoke quite well around some of the challenges facing the continent, including liquidity issues, low growth. Some of the countries are in debt distress. I think 18 countries are at risk at the moment. Now, for a bank like ours, we are on the continent. We built our long-term plan on this continent. But we have to be responsible. How do you invest when you have the liquidity issues, when you have debt distress? Because it's very easy for us all here to say, well, the level of debt has been overstated. But here's the real problem. It's not just the level of percentage of GDP that is considered. It's how much it is costing the government to service the debt. Now, what we're seeing in some countries, 40% of government revenues are servicing debt. Now, it is simply not sustainable if you don't have money to invest, if you don't have money to repay investors for capital projects. And you say, well, ignore the debt. It's a very important point. So I think there are 3 things that need to be done. The international community has to make the commitment. For the financial sector, our money and our capital base is not enough, given the need. So we've got to revisit all debates around blended finance. What hasn't worked? Why doesn't it work? We have to talk about issues around ODA. Is ODA relevant in 2022? And how do you mobilize it to deal with climate finance challenges? And then another issue is how do you support or incentivize the private sector further to invest in the sector? Because if there is no incentive for the financial markets to invest in climate-related projects, on a risk-adjusted basis, there might be limited appetite. And I think for me, this is what the international community can do. You can use capital standards, you can use tax, you can use incentives to actually reduce the cost of climate projects. And finally, the point around de-risking. How do you de-risk projects in many of our economies? I think previous speakers spoke about political risk insurance. But I think there's a bit more than that. So long as we are no credit rating agencies are assigning private ratings to companies, we will have to factor that with the cost of the project. We can't wish this away. We have investors and we have other stakeholders who want bank stability. One of the risks that we have on our continent is that if not well managed, climate change could lead to financial stability issues. Because investors have assets in countries that are highly exposed to climate change. 3 weeks ago in Durban, South Africa, there was significant floods. And you can start to see the impact of physical risks on bank balance sheets and assets across the economy. So we've got to also address this in a meaningful way. So maybe just to conclude, Mayor, we've got to agree there are outstanding issues. We've got to agree that macroeconomic stability is a non-negotiable. Policy certainty is a non-negotiable. And policy, not just one part of policy, everything from tax and fiscal incentives, everything including energy policy, PPAs, and property rights. These projects are 20-year-long projects. And we also got to accept that there's a financing question that has not been answered. We all know African governments have constraints. We all know that the financial sector has constraints. So if we're able to address the long-term question, we've got to mobilize funding. Be it the blended finance model, be it the model that's being proposed by the OECD Development Center and other partners, but also we'll look at whether or not the SDRs could not be used to support climate finance on the continent. I think if any of those things are not done, we will only be dreaming about funding Africa's transition to net zero. And let's be clear, net zero is not just an ecological problem. It's a social problem, it's a political problem. And again, energy security is important to all countries. Economic development is important to all countries, especially in our region where you have high levels of poverty and inequality in some countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Il me semble que très clair. It seems to me that Sydney just enriched the presentations that were done this morning and came up with arguments that are similar to those of President Macky Sall by taking part to the ministerial meeting of OECD. Why? Because you identified a set of areas, and we have to come up with proper regulations. You talked about taxation and the macroeconomic stability and all that. But also you told us that it is not just an issue to be left to countries individually. There is a macro dimension, the multilateral dimension. And for this purpose, I remember that in another life, you suggested earlier to reform the international cooperation policies, and I was at the development center, and we created together the idea of transition development. We have to reform the cooperation policies, and you gave us food for thought. And I would like if you're unable to give the floor immediately to Mrs. Lawrence for you. He's here, so I put you on hold, and we have Arno, who is able to get connected with us. Arno, are you there? Are you there, Arno? So here we go. That seemed like a meditation. Please, Arno, we started with Sydney, who talked to us about the needs for regulation at the global level. So I'd like to ask you, given your capabilities and experience and the work you've done with the agency to set up the framework. So in terms of energy transition, how do we need to proceed? You have 7 minutes. Well, you have to increase the volume, otherwise we can. You have to increase the volume. We cannot hear you, sir. We cannot hear you at the interpretation booth. We're not hearing you. So, we cannot hear you. We cannot hear you, sir. We have issues with the volume. We cannot hear you. We cannot hear. We have issues here at the interpretation booth. Please, could you fix that? We have technical glitches. The volume is not good. We cannot hear you. We have technical glitches here. I'm so sorry. We have technical glitches. We're trying to fix that. We have technical glitches.
cannot hear him well at the booth here. We cannot hear him. We have technical glitches. Sorry. To keep the level of oil, we have technical glitches.
Entre aujourd'hui et 2030, une personne sur deux.
Between today and 2030, 1 out of 2 people will be in Africa, so this demographic growth in Africa will require new organizations, and here the work to be done by the organization on the basis of scenarios, and we with the observatory, despite the huge energy potential of the African continent, many Africans are poor at the energetical level.
Étudier un autre scénario, un autre futur qui est possible pour le continent, qui serait celui d'une transition.
So the energy transition for all and a sustainable and fair energy transition is necessary, and also the universal access to energy by 2030, which is among the objectives of the United Nations, and also to help African countries reach the objectives, and by 2030, according to our scenarios, 50% of the African continent will be covered, and in most scenarios, the third quarters of the energy potential will be developed, and we'll have more important means. And there are two key issues that were raised: employment for the population, energy transition for Africa, and also a fair transition. And South Africa, which has huge coal resources, you have thousands of miners, and we seek to create new jobs and to meet the needs regarding youth employment. And now we're talking about the paradox in terms of energy challenges for Africa. When we look at the greenhouse effects, Africa represents less than 2%, and Africa contributes to the sequestration of CO2, and we have the more affected areas, areas that are more affected by climate change in Africa, and we need to have all of our tools to meet the climate change issues. For instance, in Mozambique, we have about 40% of the population who have access to electricity. Having said that, there are some items like the use of coal for the production of electricity and all the new investment in natural gas will help us move towards other fields. And Africa has huge potentials in terms of renewable energy, wind energy. We have Namibia, which has the best resources in the world. We also have the solar energy. Just to give you a figure, the African continent has about 40% of the global solar resources, and just 4% have been installed. We have a lot of solar energy in Africa, and we have Belgium, which is not that sunny. But if you look at the issue for the exploitation of fossil energy, well, during the pandemic, we had about 20% of the oil production in Africa. That was decreased, and after the pandemic, we had a strong exploitation because the investment were really low during the pandemic, and now at the global level we have the gas coming from Russia, which is really high demand then, and Africa has very limited infrastructures regarding natural gas. And when we look at the perspectives on gas and oil, we have the exportations. In other words, the states which have the resources, they're more sensible to the global demand. And we are in a situation where Europe is looking for the Russian gas in the short term, but also in the long term, Europe wants to be free from the Russian gas. So the states, they have to mobilize resources in gas and oil. And for Africa, we have to come up with a balance between the internal needs and the exploitation needs, so we can set up infrastructure plans that are adapted in the short and long term, and especially to be able to develop projects, because there is a strong global competition, and maybe the key to success, because the investment, and in our scenario, for a clean energy for Africa, we have to multiply it by 5, the investments, and for global clean energy, the countries need to have well-planned programs, and the international community will give the opportunity on how to mobilize investment and how we can keep